Hello and welcome to Psyched, the show where we explore psychedelics through social, economic, and political perspectives. Next up, we have two speakers. First, we have Genesee Herzberg. Genesee is a licensed psychologist practicing in Berkeley, California. She is co-founder of Sage Integrative Health, a holistic health and psychedelic therapy clinic in Berkeley, California, and Sage Institute, a nonprofit sliding scale psychedelic clinic and training center in Oakland, California. Dr. Herzberg is also a co-therapist for MAPS MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD research. She is passionate about increasing the accessibility of psychedelic medicine and supporting the field in moving towards greater inclusivity of diverse and traditionally marginalized voices. The second speaker is Jason Butler. Jason is a licensed clinical psychologist in practice in Oakland, California, offering depth psychotherapy and ketamine-assisted therapy, as well as associate professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He is a co-founder and training director at Sage Institute. He has written several articles and book chapters focused on the intersection of depth psychology and social justice, as well as a book entitled Archetypal Psychotherapy: The Clinical Legacy of James Hillman. He has volunteered with the Zendo Project at Burning Man and is a therapist with MAPS Expanded Access MDMA for treatment-resistant PTSD study. He is deeply committed to broadening diversity, accessibility, and theoretical rigor in the field of psychedelic medicine. Genesee and Jason, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to Psyched.
Hi, thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you. Genesee, do you want to introduce yourself first a little bit more?
I think that you covered most of it there, and the only thing I'll add is that I primarily work with ketamine and MDMA right now, just to kind of highlight the specific types of psychedelic medicines that I'm working with at this time.
Yeah, so I'll jump in and just say we're calling in from Berkeley, California, unceded Ohlone land, and I've been joining the country in this region, in the world, with direct actions in response to the murders of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and most recently, Sean Monterosa, who was recently shot 5 times by Vallejo police officer Jarrett Tong, despite the fact that Sean was unarmed and cooperative. So I wanted to contextualize where we are right in the here and now, and just begin our conversation by saying, with so much emotional pain.
Jason, I'm going to pause. I'm noticing that it looks like your video isn't on. Do you want to turn that on?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. Here I am. Thanks. So I just wanted to say that, with so much emotional pain surfacing around the world in relation to the recent police murders, there are some very important conversations happening around racial trauma and collective trauma more broadly. And before going into what I mean by racial trauma, I just want to make a few important preliminary comments. So first, just acknowledging my positionality as I speak to these issues, coming from multiple dominant identities, and most namely as a white person. I want to say that my articulation of this information will always be imperfect, and that in trying to speak to issues around racial justice, I may inadvertently replicate, or we may inadvertently replicate, the very thing that we're trying to address. So I want to say we're very open and receptive to feedback, especially from folks of color who are most affected by the things that we'll be speaking to. I also want to quote Sarah Ahmed, who's a critical race theorist. And she said, "The project of making whiteness visible only makes sense from the point of view of those for whom it is invisible." So I'm speaking namely in defining racial trauma to those who are oblivious to it, to those who have occupied more dominant identities and have been blind to this brutal history. So to go on, I'll say, in using the word racial trauma, I'm referring to the devastating impact of both acute instances of trauma inflicted on individuals or communities through direct actions of systemic racism, like the legacy of police brutality that I was just referencing, over policing folks who occupy non-dominant racial identities, namely Black and Indigenous people. I'm also referring to the intergenerational transmission of trauma, which is maybe a less known notion. And this is a notion that's been elaborated beautifully by Dr. Joy DeGruy, who wrote a fantastic book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. So it's an excellent reference if you're needing more information on this. So in regard to racial trauma, we can imagine the legacy of practices of white supremacy in this country, with the founding of the country based on the genocide of Native Americans and 300 years of slavery, plus the contemporary versions of enslavement through mass incarceration of Black and Brown people. So Genesee, now that I've kind of set a little bit of a groundwork for racial trauma, I would just want to ask you a question. So as a trauma therapist working with psychedelics as a tool to assist in healing trauma, I'm wondering if you can speak to your perspective on our collective situation from a trauma-informed perspective.
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to. So first I want to say that trauma is more prevalent than many people realize. It lives in our bodies in nearly imperceptible ways. Often in my work, people come in struggling with depression or anxiety, and as we dig deeper, we find that there's trauma somewhere in their history, either very early on or somewhere along their lives. So, as we speak, you may start to recognize some of these things in yourself. PTSD is most frequently understood as an acutely traumatic experience that happens through a major and overwhelming event, like a car accident, a police shooting, or in wartime. But there are many more subtle ways that one can experience trauma. It's important to know that trauma is passed down from generation to generation. So epigenetic studies have shown that traumatic experiences are passed down through the DNA and found up to 14 generations later. It's also passed down through the nervous system. So that's the system that when something intense happens, puts us into fight, flight, or freeze. Trauma in the caregiver is tangibly felt and then adopted by infants in their earliest interactions and experiences. And then with our country's history of genocide, slavery, colonization, and war, in addition to modern day racism inherent in our systems, there's a lot that's passed down, especially for those from marginalized communities. Systemic and environmental racism has a profound impact on the nervous system, resulting in many of the same symptoms that are common in acute instances of trauma, like car accidents or sexual assault.
Yeah, and so I'll jump in and say to make these things really grounded in lived experience, I'll offer a few examples. This is drawing from Imani Perry's excellent work in her book called More Beautiful and More Terrible. Imani Perry is another critical race theorist. So she says, if you're Black or brown, you're less likely to receive decent medical care and a quality education from teachers who have high expectations of you, and less likely to live in a safe community. You're more likely to be exposed to environmental hazards, to live in poverty, and to experience food insecurity. A few statistics that I'll offer. Police killed 1,099 people in 2019. Black people were 24% of those killed, despite being only 13% of the population. So Black people are 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white people. A second example, very, very relevant to our times, in Michigan, Black people make up 14.1% of the population, but 40% of the COVID-19 deaths, reflecting the inequitable healthcare made available to Black people in this country.
So being the victim of violence or some of these subtler experiences certainly impacts trauma, but also inflicting violence on others can have a traumatic impact. So, the police in a police shooting can be traumatized as well, as can combat veterans, etc. It also can be traumatic to witness or to be a bystander in the face of trauma.
Yeah, so here I'll jump in and point to the work of liberation psychology and authors Mary Watkins and Helene Schulman, who outline what they call the pathologies of bystanding. What they're trying to describe there is how it makes us sick to turn away from these systemic forms of oppression and violence that we see around us. And they made use of a term called psychic numbing, which is a kind of a psychological symptom that we see in people who are exposed to trauma, where in which a certain part of the sensitivity of the psyche begins to shut down and deaden to the world. I think those who identify as white may do well to kind of look at themselves and see what aspects of psychic numbing might be there in their experience as they turn away from the brutality of racism in this country.
So now that we've gotten a little bit into what trauma looks like and the ways that it can show up in people coming from different backgrounds and identities, we, and really what we're saying here is that trauma can look like a process of desensitization, a process of numbing, or a process of overwhelm, of overactivation of the nervous system. So how can psychedelics help us address this? So I'm going to speak here specifically to the use of MDMA and ketamine as an adjunct to psychotherapy for the treatment of trauma. So there are many other psychedelics that are being used right now for the treatment of a variety of different health concerns. But these are the two I'm going to focus on, and I want to emphasize that these are not, people aren't just going and taking MDMA or ketamine on their own. They're using them in the context of a safe therapeutic relationship with preparation sessions and integration sessions, which I found are really vital to the experience of actually healing the trauma. So psychedelic assisted therapy has the tendency to slow the system down. It increases a sense of safety, and it allows greater access to subtle physiological states within a safe container, opening up the possibility of exploring, feeling, and releasing deeply held traumatic responses. And alongside that, taking in and internalizing reparative emotional experiences. So while some more acute trauma can be released in 1 to 2 psychedelic experiences, deeply ingrained chronic developmental trauma can take time and requires the support of a safe and trusted relationship. All successful psychedelic work requires a safe therapeutic container. So we're going to get into that a little bit more, but just to expand a little bit on, how exactly psychedelic assisted therapy is working here. As the system slows down, these subtle, energetic, and psychological and emotional experiences that have been pushed down and blocked away by the defensive systems start to come closer and closer into the conscious experience. And so people are able to access feelings, memories, images of the experience itself and other, related moments in time, other ways that their body pushed away or curled up to protect themselves, and start to untangle those. And in feeling and allowing the protective movements, allowing the fear, allowing the sadness, allowing the whole range of experience to come through, we begin to heal.
So thank you. I'll add that a primary feature in creating the kind of context in which that allowing that Genesee was just pointing to, in which that kind of allowing, that deep allowing can happen, requires what we call in psychotherapy a safe container. And one feature of central importance here is the quality of safety in the relationship between the client and the therapist. To think about relational safety, we have to think about how the client is experiencing the therapist at any given moment. So let's imagine that the client is a person of color, someone who's likely experienced directly the consequences of systemic racism, which is most often carried out by a white person in position of power. So that history, we can assume, is very alive in some way in the room between the two people. If it goes unaddressed, this can result in treatments that are far less effective at best and harmful at worst. So to mitigate this dynamic, we need, in the field of psychedelic psychotherapy, we need white clinicians who have done and are doing the work ongoingly to dismantle the internalization of white supremacy in themselves, who know the brutal history of racism in this country, and who are able to speak to ways that they might be perceived by a client who is a person of color. And this is important, without getting defensive. So one form of defense that often comes up for people is wanting to be a good white person. And that results in denying ways that they are complicit in different forms of systemic oppression. So we, and by we, I mean those of us who are involved in the psychedelic healing movement, also need to look at who's occupying positions of power in the field. And one doesn't have to do complex statistics to see that the field is largely dominated by white folks. So this brings up the point of representation. Representation of diverse identities is a key part in establishing a safe container for folks of color to be able to access these deeper layers of their experience and to do the healing work that they want to do.
So we've spoken here to a couple of different elements of access, those that involves creating a safe container, and also representation. And so I want to speak to the last point that is maybe the reason that you all showed up here, which has to do with cost, financial access. So as we all know, psychedelic assisted therapy is not cheap. And this has been a real concern for many of us in the field who grapple with the importance and value that this kind of work has, and really how to make it accessible to so many people who don't have the resources to pay for it. So Jason and I and 3 other individuals, Irina Alexander, Heather Valdez, and Shanna Butler, came together to think through this. How do we make these medicines accessible to the people that need them the most? And this is where we came up with our model of a sliding scale psychedelic assisted therapy clinic, which we call Sage Institute. We opened it up in Oakland in September of last year, so we're just in the very beginning phases of it, but I'm going to tell you just a few things about it and how we're able to bring our costs down and make the treatment accessible. The primary way that we do this is through our training model. So we both train therapists and we offer low fee services by bringing in a group of psychotherapy interns who are still gaining their hours towards licensure to offer the therapy. They're closely supervised by licensed and experienced clinicians, and they receive intensive training and thorough assessment before we open up the gates for them to work with clients. So far, this has been incredibly successful. We have a wonderful first group of interns, and we're looking forward to bringing on 10 more interns next year. And it's been very, very important to us to think about the diversity of the group that we bring on, knowing that they'll be working with a very diverse group of clients. So that's another piece of accessibility, is having therapists who represent the identities of our clients. We also, though we're able to cover about half of our costs through our sliding scale client fees, we also need to fundraise in order to support the clinic in thriving. And so we're a nonprofit organization, and we seek donations through and grants through various different sources, and this helps us to stay afloat. We believe that this is kind of the model for the future in terms of how to bring psychedelic therapy to everyone who needs it. We are working to make our model as efficient and effective as possible, and then we're going to put it into a playbook so that we can share with anyone else who'd like to do something similar. We're deeply committed to making psychedelic assisted therapy accessible. Jason, is there anything that you would add that I missed there around our model?
I think you covered it well, and I'm noticing that we're approaching the time for questions, so it might be a good time to turn to those.
Hey folks, thanks so much for sharing. Really appreciate you coming on and talking to such important issues. Just reading through some of our audience questions. The first one we have is, you bring up a conversation of the internal work necessary for dismantling white supremacy. They're asking practically, how is that actually done? What does the process look like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one thing that comes immediately to mind is amongst the white identified folks in our organization, we've started a white accountability group. And that's still in its nascent form, but within that, we're having conversations around what it means to be a white person doing this work. And the reason why we separate ourselves out as white people is that the process of being in conversation around whiteness is often filled with things that would really really be quite upsetting to folks of color as we're trying to work out the blind spots. We may inadvertently hurt people. So it feels like a safety precaution in order to prevent that we're doing that with other white folks where we can work out some of the blind spots there.
Mm-hmm.
Genesee, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I would also recommend educating yourself, which involves doing a lot of reading, both from white people who are talking about this issue. You know, Robin DiAngelo is probably the most well known, but also reading the voices of people of color about their experiences. You know, it's not the best idea to go around asking for people of color to educate you about their experience, but there is so much literature out there. And there are people who are available to train through a fair exchange, so through payment, in order to develop your knowledge. So reading and then trainings, there are a lot of trainings out there as well. There's an organization called the Education for Racial Equity that has some really amazing programs, and you might seek them out. A man named Resma Manekin he has a free online training around the ways that racial trauma lives in the body. There's a lot out there, and just kind of diving in and immersing yourself in it, I think, is a good first start.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that you both brought up throughout the talk was, the trauma that can happen from actually inflicting the harm. And I was wondering, as therapists, how do you actually work with an individual that, maybe they share with you that they have inflicted harm on someone else? How do you take yourself and possibly either forgive or provide space for that individual to heal so that that harm isn't replicated, and allow for yourself to act as the impartial person in that relationship?
Yeah, thank you for asking about that. And I want to say that we all have those parts in us. We all have aggression. We all have hate. We all have violent parts of us. And so the first step for me is recognizing that within myself, which allows me to develop more compassion and understanding for the person who's right there with me. And then it's really making space for that part. The more that it can come forward in our work together, the less then it's going to express itself in the world. And typically those parts of us are protective. They're trying to protect us from a part of us that feels incredibly vulnerable and scared. And so as you start to make space for the more kind of violent feelings, aggressive feelings, the shame, the guilt around them, you start to dig down and find these very vulnerable, scared, and tender parts of us. And as you make contact with those, providing love and nurturance and safety helps the person to find their ground again and realize that they don't need to act in those ways in order to survive and in order to be loved.
Mm-hmm.
We all just want love.
Mm-hmm. And in personal relationships, how do you know when to, kind of engage in a relationship that may have hurt you, may have been harmful to you in some way, and when to step back and allow for yourself to remove yourself, distance yourself, and have that individual go about the world, especially when you might be conflicted with you disengaging, actually allowing for that person to continue creating harm?
That's another really good question. So I'd first want to think with the person that we're imagining here about whether or not they would be safe in addressing the conflict directly with the person, and to think about the qualities of safety that could be there. And then I'd like to emphasize that just expressing the way in which one has been impacted, regardless of the response from the individual, can be tremendously relieving for a person that's been injured in any way. So I try to frame it that way so that we're not basing the success of the confrontation on the response of the other. So if there's, the likelihood that they'll be physically safe in expressing what they need to express, then, that's a good indication that it could be worthwhile to try to address directly for at the very least to relieve the kind of sense of holding that hurt just to oneself. And we never know how that's going to live in the perpetrator. They could hold that and 5 years later, have some insight about that, and to the later part of your question, modify their behaviors as a result. So the impact of that can be quite significant.
Mm-hmm. I want to shift a little bit. So this is based off of one of our audience questions. One of the things that Sage is really passionate about, and a lot of individuals specifically in the psychedelics ecosystem are talking much more about today, is access, and how do we provide access. Some companies are looking at telemedicine and different ways of actually being able to provide therapeutic care at home, whether that's through ketamine assisted therapy via virtual sessions, over the phone, whatever that might be. I was hoping you both could talk about Sage's thought process and the inclusion or adoption of things like telemedicine for possibly increasing access or being able to diversify the amount of clients that you can actually bring into your doors, even if that is through a virtual way.
Sure, yeah, I can speak to that. This question has been highlighted as we entered into the pandemic and had to find alternative ways to be able to continue to work with our clients. So we shifted all of our sessions to virtual and have been working with people through telemedicine for some time. And we're just stepping into virtual ketamine sessions, actually, as we speak. We're getting that started. We took it slower than some other organizations just to see how it rolled out, but people are seeing really positive results. And while there are some pros and cons, there certainly is, it's different not to be face to face with someone, not to have the potential for human contact and touch, which is so healing. And as you're saying, it allows for greater access for some people that maybe couldn't make it out of their house, who have a really hard time getting up and motivating. Ketamine is particularly effective for people struggling with chronic depression. So I could see it opening some doors there. And also for people who live a little farther out and otherwise wouldn't be able to make it in to access these kinds of treatments that at this point are growing, but they're still, relatively rare.
Definitely. In terms of, you've developed this really cool sliding scale type of foundation for Sage. I was wondering if y'all had examples of other models that folks are using to create greater access within the space. Maybe that's for psychedelic assisted therapy, holistic healing, maybe just kind of more traditional CBT type therapy. What are some of the things that you've seen? What are other organizations that people should be looking to learn from in that process?
I wish I had more people to point you to. It's I think just one of the big questions that everyone's chewing on right now, and there aren't a lot of people who've come up with solutions at this point. I've spoken with a couple of other nonprofits, one of them in Philadelphia called Soul Mind, another one in New York called Nautilus Sanctuary, another one in Chicago called Sana Health, and they're all exploring different possibilities, but they're really kind of, I'm not sure that they're even launched at this point. So I wish I could point you to some better models, but I think it's really just a question at this point. There is a woman named Leah Mix who is looking into insurance coverage, and I think that ultimately will make a huge impact in terms of bringing down the cost. But other than that, and our model, I don't know of a lot of other ways at this point. Really the only other options out there are people who are removing the therapist from the treatment and, kind of just skimming it down. And I personally don't believe in that. I feel that there's a lot of potential for problematic things to happen. I think that a lot of the healing happens relationally, especially for people with more chronic trauma. And so I'm hesitant to move in that direction. Really, this work is relational, it's community-based. We need connections more than anything else right now.
Mm-hmm, definitely. Well, thank you both so much for coming on. We really appreciate your insights and everything you had to share. Looking forward to talking more in the future. And yeah, thank you again.
Thank you very
much. You're welcome. Thank you.
Yeah, be well. Bye-bye.